Hey guys, tonight we drift back in time to a frosty Viking settlement, the air tinged with the sharp scent of pine and salt spray, and you can almost feel the snow crunching beneath your boots, even though you're tucked in bed. You probably won't survive this history tour without craving something chilled. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments so I know who's listening in Siberia or Scottsdale. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle in, imagine yourself tramping through a crowded longhouse, the wooden beams dripping with cold mist, the scent of roasting lamb mingling with sea air, and somewhere just beyond the threshold, a mound of snow piled in a pit, quietly whispering of a forgotten treat. You press your cheek to a cool flagstone and hear the distant roar of the fjord. Fringe scholars even speculate that a handful of wealthy jarls might have dipped sweetened cream into that snow for a primitive ice cream, but whether they really did is up for debate. Historians still argue whether the Norse actually combined dairy and ice, or simply used snow to chill their mead. The mainstream fact is that Vikings kept dairy herds, cows, goats, and even sheep, providing milk, butter, and cheese for everyday sustenance. They would churn butter by rocking cloth bags back and forth, sometimes dipping them into icy water to speed up the process. But did any of that butter fat ever end up in a scoopable dessert? That's where the quirky tidbit comes in. A fringe theory from a dusty 19th century Icelandic manuscript mentions frozen cream laced with wild berries, served at a jarl's feast, though most experts dismiss it as poetic license. You trudge closer to the snow pit, your cloak brushing against glimmering flakes, and you scratch at the icy wall, tasting a hint of salt carried on the wind. You might giggle at how modern we seem, using freezers at the touch of a button, while your Viking forebears craned their necks skyward, praying for a cold snap to preserve food. But isn't it comforting to think that the craving for something sweet and cold transcends time and culture? Even if they never quite perfected the silky texture you're used to, the desire was there. With each breath you inhale faint traces of honeyed smoke, because honey was king of Viking sweeteners, drizzled over everything from porridge to roast boar. Imagine those jarls sneaking spoonfuls of frothy mead into the snow, tinkering with sweet concoctions as jesters juggled flaming torches nearby. You can almost taste the wild raspberries still warm from the midday sun, pressed into chilled cream, though scholars still debate whether berries were crushed fresh or steeped in brine fir. A gentle crack of ice jars you back, and you lean against a wooden post, the grain rough beneath your fingertips. Did they have ice cream? You mutter, half to yourself, half to the ghosts of Viking cooks who once clattered pots over the hearth. You might chuckle at the image of a burly berserker trying to lick a snow cream cone without grimacing, and you'd be right to laugh, because the truth is delightfully uncertain. Some sagas whisper of frozen treats, others mention nothing but salted meats and sour milk. As the wind whistles through a gap in the wall, you recall that earlier bit about butter. Mainstream historians agree that butter was stored in solid form through winter in sunken pits lined with straw. That method doubled as an icebox, a mini fridge of its day. Could cream survive the journey from churn to pit without turning rancid? Historians still argue whether the Norse understood basic thermodynamics, or were just lucky with their cellar design. In the hush of that longhouse, you lean back on woven pelts, feel the faint vibrations of distant chanting, and let the idea of Viking ice cream swirl in your mind. A modern aside, if you've ever rolled your eyes at experimental foodie blogs claiming to resurrect ancient recipes, just remember you're not the first to chase culinary nostalgia. Vikings might have been the original foodies, standing over a snowbank, spooning chilled breath into their mouths as they dreamed of sweeter days. Joke time. Picture a Viking influencer, clad in horned helmet, totally historically inaccurate by the way, demonstrating how to harvest snow for your ice cream vlog. Don't forget to sanitize your pickaxe, they'd say, or you might get a brain freeze, so bad you outrun your own You snort softly, feeling the edges of sleep soften around you. One more silly thought, maybe they used reindeer antlers as scoops, certainly eco-friendly, albeit a bit pointy, and as eyelids grow heavy, You savor that fringe possibility, a fleeting taste of berry-flecked cream, frozen in a snow pit under the northern light. Historians still argue whether it was myth or reality, but you drift on the notion that somewhere in a half-remembered saga, a jar of chilled cream awaited a daring soul. You trudge through a misty grove at dawn, the frost-tipped grass crunching under your boots, and you can almost taste the tang of fermented whey on your tongue, because for Vikings, diet wasn't a casual affair. You wake beside a low stone wall leaning against wooden barrels bulging with skimmed milk, and realize that dairy was as central to Norse meals as rap music is to your morning playlist, albeit with fewer bass drops. Mainstream archaeologists confirm that Viking farmers kept herds of cattle, sheep, and goats for milk, cheese, and butter all year round. In fact, isotope analysis of Norse skeletal remains shows a heavy reliance on dairy proteins, a staple literally in their bones. Historians still argue whether the average Norse peasant drank more milk than mead, so pour yourself a horn, would you? But it's clear that milk was boiled into porridge, churned into butter, and curdled into simple cheeses like skyr, a thick, tangy cousin of yogurt. Imagine gathering around a wooden trough at midday, stirring steaming grains with a ladle carved from an elk's antler. Echoes of that faux Viking influencer, with their pointy antler scoop from last section, come to mind. Skyr was often strained through cloth to yield a creamy consistency, which you might liken to modern Greek yogurt, minus the Instagram filter. Off in the corner you spot a cradle-shaped butter churn rocking back and forth, its leather bag singing a low hum as globules of fat coalesce into golden lumps. You press your palm against the cool wood, and feel the vibrations, the sensory detail so vivid you almost hear the distant echo of a jarldom feast. Fringe researchers propose that Vikings might have mixed spring water with butterfat to create an early buttermilk sorbet, although no shred of physical evidence supports that claim. Historians still argue whether this concoction ever made it from speculative lab tables into a jarl's mouth. Dairy wasn't just for liquids though. You nibble on a grainy cheese wheel, coated in straw and pine needles to keep pests away, its crust yielding a crumbly interior that melts against your tongue with a salty bite. Mainstream sagas mention cheese offered as tribute between chieftains, evidence that this humble staple carried social weight. Yet a quirky tidbit whispers that some Norse texts refer to cheese ice, ostasnot, supposedly grated into snow for a quick frozen snack, though most scholars dismiss this as scribal error or playful exaggeration. Historians still argue whether ostasnot was an actual dish or literary joke, but you tuck a thin slice between your teeth just to test the theory. As you do, the air shifts, and you catch the piquant aroma of dried fish being prepared for preservation, another cornerstone of the Norse diet. Herring, cod, and salmon were salted or smoked and hung from rafters, their pungent smell weaving through longhouse corridors like a persistent bard's refrain. Back to dairy. You recall that in summer surplus milk was left to sour in wooden vats, forming a thick layer of cream. One morning you sneak into the farmyard and skim off that cream, swirling it with mashed barberries picked at dawn. A quick dip into a snow-filled pit cools the mixture. Remember that snow pit from section 1, yielding a tangy, icy mash that's more rustic granita than smooth gelato. Historians still argue whether sour cream could survive the journey without spoiling, especially on warmer days, but you shrug off the doubt and savor a spoonful. As noon approaches, you wander toward the fields where goats nibble on heather and wild herbs. Their milk, richer and more robust than cows', was prized for its higher fat content. Peasants sometimes trade goat's cheese for barley or cured meats in village markets, juggling the economy like medieval stockbrokers. Fringe accounts suggest goat's milk was churned with pine needles for a resinous, forest-fragrant butter, though whether that ever made it to a table is debated. Historians still argue whether pine butter was culinary innovation or mere forest folklore. You pause, take a deep breath, and let the faint scent of juniper drift in. Juniper berries were occasionally steeped in cream for seasoning, adding a resinous bite to sauces served alongside roast pork. That modern aside sneaks in. If you've ever wondered why gin tastes piney, blame the Vikings or at least their descendants. 300 years of juniper usage later and you're sipping cocktails with juniper garnish, imagining your Norwegian great-great-grandfolk tossing berries into churning cream. Suppose you're wondering about refrigeration beyond snow pits. You remember the butter pits from section 1, sunken pits lined with straw or heather, filled with ice from nearby rivers and sealed with turf. These ice boxes held dairy products through spring's thaw, their interiors kept at near freezing temperature. Mainstream historians confirm that some wealthy farms even built underground chambers partially flooded in winter to create natural refrigeration. After all, you can't have ice cream without ice, or so logic dictates. But here's a quirky fringe claim. A handful of elders in Iceland allegedly stored butter in barrels submerged offshore, using ocean currents to keep it cool. Local fishermen still spin yarns about barrels drifting loose, discovered months later, butter still intact. Historians still argue whether saltwater storage was ever practiced, but it's a captivating image. Imagine bobbing barrels of butter in the North Atlantic, like a dairy-filled maritime buoys. As you slurp the last of your Barbary cream, the sun tilts low and the longhouse door creaks open. You're invited to a communal meal, steaming bowls of goat stew, slices of sky-thickened porridge, and plates of seared fish topped with herbed cream. You perch on a straw-woven bench, feeling the heat of the hearth on your back, and tasting the interplay of smoky wood, tangy dairy, and salty. One of the chieftain's children giggles, recounting how she tried to make her own frozen cream by balancing a bowl on the gable roof overnight, an experiment ending in a drop of frozen cream smashing on the stones below. Joke break: picture that kid lecturing you on the perils of rooftop freezers, as if she's unveiling the next season of a Viking survival show. Don't forget to bring your antler scoop, she chide, or you'll be eating cream with your bare hands. Talk about bacterial mischief. You settle back, consider the richness of Norse diet essentials: milk, cheese, butter, whey, each element a building block of daily life, each hinting at the possibility of a frozen delight. Whether they dreamed of ice cream cones or simply craved something cold against their tongues, the bones of their meals speak volumes. Historians still argue whether chilled dairy was a widespread practice or merely confined to the seigneurial elite. Your eyelids flutter and you feel the edges of consciousness soften. The scent of simmering stew lingers, and you realize that the Norse appetite for dairy, rich, varied, and ingenious, was as essential to their survival as their You might chuckle at how modern refrigerators hum lullabies while these Iron Age iceboxes relied on snow, straw, and ocean. But isn't it comforting to know that across a millennium humanity's hunger for creamy indulgence remains unwavering? You slip from the smoky glow of the longhouse into the crisp air, the twilight sky streaked with violet, and head toward a low stone enclosure dug into the earth's flank. Here, Vikings practiced preservation methods that feel like alchemy in your modern mind. Snow pits, ice-filled cellars, and river ice harvesting, turning raw ingredients into relics that lasted seasons. Imagine kneeling at the edge of that pit, pressing your palm into compacted snow layered beneath a roof of turf and brush, whispering promises of frozen delights yet undiscovered. Mainstream archaeology confirms that Vikings used snow pits, shallow depressions dug in shaded areas and lined with grass or straw, to store perishable goods through summer months. They'd shovel fresh snow into the pit each winter, packing it tight until it turned into granular ice, then cover it with insulating straw. By midsummer, you'd find blocks of near-pure ice nestled under layers of turf, waiting to chill milk, butter, or meat. You stretch out a gloved hand and feel the cold seep through your mitt, a silent reminder of nature's free refrigerator. Historians still argue whether these snow pits were primarily for preserving meats or for culinary experimentation, but you don't need an academic consensus to sense their potential. You imagine scooping granulated ice into a wooden bowl, layering it with cream you've skimmed from morning milking, and watching it freeze into a coarse, slushy cream, maybe the earliest ancestor of ice cream. A quirky tidbit: some sagas mention frozen fish satchels hung in snow pits to chill, leading fringe scholars to speculate that Vikings might have enjoyed chilled seafood amuse-bouches alongside sweet treats. Historians still argue whether those fish satchels were culinary curiosities or merely a practical way to keep fish fresh. Next, you follow a narrow tunnel carved beneath the longhouse, a cellar chamber built partially underground and vaulted with hefty oak beams. Inside, the temperature hovers just above freezing, the air thick with the scent of straw and smoke. Here, barrels of butter, wheels of cheese, and sometimes even vessels of mead slosh gently in the half-darkness. Mainstream studies of medieval cellars show that these spaces were sometimes filled with river ice harvested in winter and packed between stacked barrels, creating an early form of refrigeration. You run a finger along a frozen rim dripping with condensation, marveling that such simple ingenuity kept food from spoiling. Historians still argue whether all Viking farms had access to these ice cellars or if they were reserved for wealthy jarls. But you crouch beside one and imagine reaching for a wooden ladle, dipping into a bucket of cream cooled by crushed river ice. That sensation, a rush of cold on your tongue, is nearly identical to the first scoop of ice cream you tasted as a child, back when a freezer felt like magic. A playful aside: picture a Viking farmer muttering, "I just wanted to keep my butter fresh, but now it's a frosty snack," before grabbing a handful of chilled cream straight from the pit. You climb back outside and trek to a frozen inlet where the river's surface crackles like glass. Winter's ice is thick enough here to bear weight, so peasants carve off rectangular blocks using long-handled chisels. Each clink of steel against ice echoes across the frozen expanse. You grip the chisel, chip away, and feel the sting of cold spray on your cheeks as ice chunks break free. A quirky artifact, a 9th century iron ice pick found in a Norwegian burial mound, attests to this ritual. Historians still argue whether that pick was used for elaborate food preservation or buried as a symbolic tool for the afterlife. Once harvested, ice blocks are hauled on sleds back to insulated storage areas near the longhouse. Straw, wool blankets, and even animal pelts cushion the blocks, slowing melting. You wrap your arms around one such block, feeling its heft slow your heart. Modern thermal analysis shows that well-insulated snow pits could preserve ice blocks for months, even through spring thaws. Those same principles underlie today's coolers. Perhaps Vikings were unwitting pioneers of portable refrigeration. You carry a small fragment of river ice back to the hearth and toss it into a wooden basin of cream. The ice bombs fizz and crackle, tiny geysers of frost erupting as warm cream meets frozen core. You stir, watching a silky slurry. It's far from the churned, aerated texture of modern ice cream, but the slushy mixture is undeniably refreshing. Historians still argue whether Vikings ever bothered to strain out ice crystals for smoothness, or if they were content with coarse, rustic churns of frozen dairy. A modern aside drifts through your mind. On hot days you fish popsicles from your freezer, wrapped in plastic. Here, the Vikings relied on straw and ice pits. No plastic required. One fringe account suggests that some Giles even imported salt from Mediterranean traders to lower ice's freezing point, creating brine-cooled mixtures that froze faster. Though no physical proof surfaces, the notion tantalizes you with the idea of a Viking salted cream sorbet. Historians still argue whether they possessed the chemical savvy for such brine experiments or if it's just a tasty legend. Turning from the inlet, you notice a conical mound of snow domed with grass near the barn. This is the snow dome, a communal pit where villagers deposit clean snow throughout winter. In spring, the dome's core remains icy, and as needed, villagers carve off shavings to cool fish or cream. You lean over, breathe in cold mist, and collect a handful of snowflakes. Each one glitters in the half-light, unique and impossible to replicate. A quirky local tale tells of children sneaking into the snow dome at night to craft snow cones flavored with wild honey, perhaps the earliest snowball tree. Historians still argue whether honey snow desserts were widespread or confined to gossip among children. In the final glow of dusk, you return to the longhouse with buckets of ice, barrels of cream, and a handful of hand-picked berries. Farmers set a large stone slab near the fire's edge and spread a chilled mixture of cream and crushed ice across it, adding honey and berry juice like modern chefs on a flat-top grill. The slab's surface freezes the mixture into thin sheets, which they scrape into ribbons. An early form of zeshinska, a braided ice dessert. While no written Norse recipes survive, similar methods appear in Persian texts centuries later, suggesting that the idea of freezing sweet mixtures traveled far. Historians still argue whether such techniques developed independently in Scandinavia or were borrowed via trade networks. You taste a ribbon of that slushy dessert, cold against your tongue and sweet with berry perfume. It's rough, crunchy and fleeting, nothing like the creamy swirl you know today, but its essence speaks of human ingenuity. You lean against a beam, the wood warming under your hand, and let the hush of the evening lull you. Imagine a Viking cook whispering to an apprentice, "One day they'll call this ice cream," half in jest, half in wonder. A playful thought drifts in as you close your eyes. If Viking chefs had Instagram, they'd hashtag snowpit Sunday and ancient chill. You giggle softly, feeling the edges of sleep gather around your senses like a nest of straw. The smell of burning wood, the taste of honeyed ice, the memory of snow-crusted cellars, all swirl together as you drift toward dreams of your own freezers. Historians still argue whether these preservation methods ever culminated in a true ice cream, but as you sink into slumber, the fact remains that Vikings mastered the art of chilling food, one snow pit at a time. You rise before dawn, the pale Nordic sky just a whisper of light, and follow a winding track through mist-laden fields to the Viking farmstead's pasture. Dew clings to the grass like morning tears, and the lowing of cattle rolls over the hills, a deep, rhythmic hum that settles in your chest. Here, milking isn't a quick chore. It's a ritual woven into daily survival. You step gingerly past clumps of heather, the sweet sour tang of fermented whey still clinging to the air from yesterday's churn, and you prepare to witness the ancient art of dairy herding. Mainstream evidence tells us that Viking farmers managed mixed herds of cows, goats, and occasionally sheep, moving them seasonally between coastal marshes and upland pastures in a practice called transhumance. In spring, you watch them guide the herd through thawing rivers, the cattle's hooves churning muddy water into a creamy swirl, and you can almost dip your hand in to taste that mineral-rich spring. Historians still argue whether this seasonal migration was driven more by forage quality or by social customs tied to feast days, but you don't need an academic treatise to feel the power of it. You approach the cow herd first, broad-horned, shaggy beasts with rust-colored coats and liquid brown eyes that track your every move. A herdsman leans on a wooden staff carved with runes, his woolen tunic stiff with morning frost. He holds a simple milking stool, 3 short legs and a flat seat, braced just beneath a cow's udder. You crouch beside him and feel the warmth of the animal's side, the fur brushing against your palm like a coarse blanket. With practiced ease, he strips a rope of milk into a bent wood pail, each spurt glinting white in the dawn light. A quirky tidbit: some fringe accounts claim that Vikings used goat hair woven into small cloth bags as primitive milk filters, catching curd bits before the milk even hit the pail. While no archaeological shred confirms this, you can almost picture goats' coarse hairs tangled in the threads, imparting a faint, musky flavor. Historians still argue whether such filtering methods were widespread or simply the imaginings of later scribes trying to romanticize rural life. Meanwhile, you wander toward the goat enclosure, an airy pen lined with driftwood and rush mats. These goats, with their mischievous bleats, scale every outcrop and nibble on heather, their bellies rumbling with wild herb. Their milk is richer, oilier than cows, perfect for firmer cheeses and arguably better for frozen treats. The herdswoman here sits on a low rocker, humming a lullaby to calm the herd, her fingers deftly coaxing milk into a wooden pail carved from an old oak stump. You inhale the sharp scent of goat milk, tangy and sweet, a bracing contrast to the cow's smoother sweetness. In the corner you spy a wooden yoke hung from a post, used to tether 2 goats side by side for simultaneous milking. A mainstream fact: this simple device increased efficiency, allowing a single farmer to milk multiple animals in one go. You rest your hand on the yoke's worn surface, feeling the grooves where countless ropes once frayed, and wonder at the innovation born of necessity. Historians still argue whether yoke milking was a specialized technique, limited to larger farms or a common sight across all Viking settlements. As midday sun warms the yard, the herd is driven into a grassy enclosure. You trail the herdsman behind them as he shakes a small wooden rattle, a device to coax reluctant cows toward the milking bench. The sound is a hollow clack, like a distant waterfall, and the cattle shuffle forward, their hooves clinking against stone slabs. You recall the butter pits from Section 1, where cream rose to the top of milk barrels, and was later skimmed off for churning. Today's milking yields a fresh vat of cream-rich milk, its surface gleaming like liquid pearl. Modern asides drift in. You think of artisanal cheesemakers in your own town toting goats up hills for that perfect hillside flavor. The parallels make you chuckle. These same techniques, spruced up with Instagram filters, now fetch top dollar at farmers' market. Yet nothing beats the raw authenticity of the Viking farm. No refrigeration trucks, just time-tested ingenuity. Back at the longhouse, 2 wooden vats await the day's haul. One is lined with coarsely woven linen cloth, a primitive strainer separating larger curds to craft skyr. The other is sealed with a tight wooden lid for letting milk set into cream. A small circle of ice from last winter's harvest lies in a shallow basin nearby, ice chips chipped off a larger block and tucked into straw to survive the thaw. You pour a ladle of fresh milk over these shards, watching clouds of warmth swirl into jagged ice. That gesture hints at the earliest experiments in cooling dairy, a fleeting moment of what might become ice cream centuries later. You glance at the herdswoman again and notice her tool belt, a curved knife for slicing through straw bales, a small leather pouch of herbs for rat deterrents, and a bone spoon possibly used to test milk's thickness. A fringe theory suggests these bone spoons were dipped into snow pits to scoop and test early snow cream mixtures of milk and snow. Historians still argue whether those bone implements were designed for culinary use or were merely multi-purpose farm tools. As evening approaches, the herd is led back through that same river crossing, the golden light splashing across their wet hides. You follow on foot, the cool current lapping at your ankles, and you scoop handfuls of river ice into a hide-lined bucket. Imagine that ice mingling with the day's milking, creating slushy layers of cream and froth. You can almost taste it, a whisper of something frozen, a memory of a treat you've never truly had. You settle in near the smoke-blackened hearth, filled with logs that hiss and spark. The milk of the day simmers in a clay pot, leaving frothy ridges where steam meets cream. A herdsman stoops to stir it, then ladles a bit into a bowl, adding a drizzle of heather honey and a handful of newly picked cloudberries. You lift the bowl to your lips. The warmth of the cream contrasts sharply with the chill lingering on your tongue from those river ice chips. It's not a full-on ice cream, but that interplay of hot and cold, sweet and earthy, feels like a distant echo of what could have. A light jest drifts through the longhouse. Imagine a Viking YouTube tutorial on dairy herding. How to milk a goat in 10 easy steps. The herdswoman would smirk, settle her antler scoop and remind viewers, don't forget to thank your goat for the milk or she might nibble your clothes. You grin at the absurdity, feeling sleep press at your eyelids like a heavy wool blanket. By candlelight you watch as the day's milk is poured into wooden barrels, sealed with waxed cloth, and tucked into the underground ice chamber, a cool grotto hewn from earth and packed snow. Here the stage is set. Vessels of pure cream rest alongside ice, waiting for the right moment to be mixed, churned or simply scooped into eager mouths. Whether the Vikings ever crossed that threshold into true ice cream remains in question, but the care they lavished on their dairy hints at a curiosity that transcends necessity. You lean back, smelling the sweet smoke and cooling milk, and let the rhythms of milking life lull you closer to dream. Historians still argue whether these techniques birthed any frosty concoctions beyond butter and cheese, but as you drift, it's easy to imagine a spoonful of chilled cream, flecked with wild herbs, dissolving on your tongue under a northern sky. You slip back into the hush of the longhouse kitchen, where the amber glow of the hearth casts dancing shadows on wooden beams, and your senses come alive with the rich perfume of honeyed smoke and berry steams. You draw your cloak tighter, remember that brine-cooled ice pit, and settle before a low stone table strewn with rustic bowls carved from birch. Tonight's theme is flavor, the sweeteners and aromatics that might have turned chilled cream into something you'd actually crave. So lean forward, because you're about to learn how Vikings might have spiked their snow-dipped dairy with the wild taste of the north. Mainstream historians agree that honey was the predominant sweetener in Norse cuisine. Beekeeping thrived in woodland clearings where hives hung from oak branches, and skilled beewomen harvested combs while humming protective chants. You can almost feel the sticky warmth as they crush honey-laden wax, watching golden nectar drip like liquid sunshine into a wooden bucket. That thick sweetness was drizzled over porridge, slathered on flatbreads, and if you close your eyes might have been whisked into chilled cream for a primitive ice cream. Historians still argue whether honey-cream mixtures were a daily indulgence for peasants, or reserved for celebratory feasts among jarls, but you taste a spoonful anyway, letting the floral notes bloom on your tongue. The table before you holds shallow bowls of crushed berries, vibrant globes of cloudberry, bowlberry and lingonberry, their juices gleaming like stained glass. You lift a spoonful of cloudberry mash, its tart sweetness cutting through the honey's richness, and smear it onto a slice of barley cake. That sensory contrast hints at how berries could have flavored frozen cream. A layer of honey-sweet dairy topped with twinkling red jewel bits. A quirky fringe account even claims that some Viking cooks macerated berries in mead overnight, before mixing the syrup into snow-chilled cream, creating an early berry mead sorbet. Historians still argue whether that technique ever passed from sloshing in taverns to the dinner tables of jarls, but you let the fringe magic linger on your palate. You reach for a small mortar and pestle carved from soapstone, cool and smooth under your palm, and begin grinding dried juniper berries. A cloud of resinous aroma drifts upward, mingling with sweet smoke. Juniper was chiefly used for flavoring meats and brewing, but experimental cooks might have crushed the berries with a pinch of salt and stirred them into creamy mixtures for a piney counterpoint. Historians still argue whether juniper cream concoctions were mere woodland lore or genuine recipes in rustic cookbooks, but the idea tickles your imagination. You sniff the crushed spice and feel a bracing zing that could wake even the drowsiest of YouTube. Off to the side you notice a tarnished bronze ladle, likely a gift from a Baltic trader, filled with a coarse-grained salt. Salt, surprisingly, was itself a precious commodity in Viking society, traded over oceans and recopied in merchant ledger. A pinch of sea salt would have enhanced sweet notes and numbed the cold bite of ice shards. You taste a speck on your fingertip. It draws out the honey's floral top notes and makes the berries sing. That balance of sweet and salty is so modern it could be a gourmet TikTok challenge. You chuckle, imagining a Viking patisserie influencer posting salted scar sensation. In the corner, a clay jar holds steeped herbal infusions, spruce tips, wild mint, and angelica root. You pour a few drops of smoky mint infusion into a bowl of cream, where it curls around tiny ice crystals, releasing bright, cooling vapors. Fringe herbalists whisper that adding tree essences to dairy wasn't just culinary, it was medicinal, warding off scurvy and soothing winter cough. Historians still argue whether tree-infused creams were brewed for healing or simply brewed out of boredom during long winters. But you inhale those minty fumes and feel the warmth of conifer forests under soft snapping twigs. And a mainstream fact: Vikings gathered elderflower in summer to steep into syrups, their umbels floating like lace in boiling water before honey was added for sweetness. Elderflower's delicate perfume might have been stirred into chilled creams, yielding a floral scented snow confection. You dip a flower petal in syrup and press it to your lips. Its fresh perfume reminds you of spring thaw after months of frost. You recall the snow dome from Section 4 and picture villagers scooping softened elderflower-infused snow into woven bark cups. Historians still argue whether elderflower desserts were confined to the wealthy elite or slipped into common kitchens alongside barley stews. But even peasants could pluck blossoms from hedgerows. Modern asides sneak in. If you've ever drizzled lavender syrup on ice cream or sprinkled basil atop gelato, you're channeling your inner Viking, though they probably never paired basil with cream, considering it an exotic import from far-off lands. Speaking of imports, you reach for a crushed pile of caraway seeds, found in Viking-era graves as exotic vestiges of trade with the Abbasid Caliphate. A dash of caraway in cream adds a bittersweet, licorice-like backbone. You nibble a seed and feel the warmth spread across your tongue, a reminder of long-distance trade routes that brought flavors as well as goods. Your gaze flits back to the hearth's flame, where a small pot simmers with wild rose petals and honey, preparing a rose honey syrup that you might swirl into chilled cream for a perfumed indulgence. Fringe saga fragments mention frozen rose lace, but they're so fragmentary that most scholars dismiss them as poetic nonsense or scribal embellishment. Historians still argue whether rose-infused frosts were more fantasy than feast, but as you lift a spoon of pink syrup to your lips, you almost believe it could exist. You pause for a moment of sarcasm. Picture a Viking version of Chopped where jarls compete to create the most creative ice treat. Contestant Thorvald, your entry: Skyer ice pops with seaweed salt crust. How do you plead? You'd hear a smoky-voiced judge scowl. You snicker at the absurdity, feeling the gentle drowsiness settle in like a well-worn fur blanket. As the night deepens, villagers gather around a low trough filled with crushed ice and honey cream mixture. They pass wooden spoons, each person adding a personal twist. Some sprinkle a handful of berry seeds. Others dot the surface with pine resin salve, ostensibly for flavor, technically for preservation. Laughter ripples through the group as one farmer accidentally flips a spoonful of icy cream onto his tunic, eliciting groans and good-natured teasing. You watch the communal ritual unfold and feel the warmth of shared delight, the same camaraderie you feel when you crack open a pint of modern gelato with friends. Finally, a paterfamilias lifts a horn of chilled cream, infused with honey, juniper, and cloudberry dust. He roars, and the group echoes the toast before slurping the icy concoction with relish. That simple act, lifting frozen dairy to lips in a communal cheer, could be the closest thing to ice cream that Vikings ever truly knew. Even if they lacked churned richness or silky smoothness, the fundamental joy of sweet, cold indulgence connects you across a millennium. You lean back against a furs-lined bench, the scented smoke swirling above, and trace the rim of your empty bowl. Honey, Berries, herbs, salt, each flavor plays its part, weaving a tapestry of taste that transcends time. Historians still argue whether these experiments birthed an official ice cream recipe or simply remained culinary curiosities. But your tongue has already decided the Vikings had a sweet tooth worthy of any modern dessert menu. As your eyelids droop, you savor the lingering taste of wild flavors, the sticky warmth of honey, the sharp tang of berries, the resinous snap of juniper, and imagine that same delight you feel when you open your freezer at home. A final joke drifts through. Someone should invent a Viking-themed ice cream parlor, Valhalla Scoops, where every bite is an epic. You chuckle softly, feeling sleep beckon like a soft straw mat. You emerge from the longhouse into a courtyard, alive with torchlight flickering across rough timber tables, stacked high with platters of roasted boar, steaming fish, and loaves of dark rye. Because feast nights in a Viking hall were spectacles equal parts ritual and revelry. The air vibrates with the thrum of lyres and the rhythmic stomp of dancers, while you navigate between benches heaped with wooden bowls of skyr, slabs of butter, and horns brimming with golden mead. Mainstream chronicles confirm that communal feasts, blots, and symbols were central to Norse social life, marking harvests and holy days with food, drink, and toasts to gods and ancestors. You slide onto a bench alongside leather-clad jarls and wide-grinned thralls, feeling the rough-hewn wood warm under the combined weight of bodies and anticipation. A serving maid appears carrying a shallow wicker basket, inside hunks of snow-colored lichen-covered ice, swirled with drops of berry juice. She passes it around and you take a slender slice. When you bite, you taste a whisper of cold, a hint of cloudberry sweetness, though historians still argue whether such ice cups were standard fare or fleeting curiosities in the carnival of Viking feast. Above you, a long, low roof creaks as wind gusts through carved dragon heads. Torches gutter, and smoke curls upward in lazy spirals, carrying scents of pine-smoked salmon and honeyed ribs. You remember the butter pits from earlier sections. Now butter is sculpted into small medallions sprinkled with crushed juniper and offered as palate cleansers between hearty servings of salted fish. A quirky detail from a little-known saga describes jarls spitting out these butter talismans into bowls of snow, perhaps a comedic challenge or dare before retasting their feast. Historians still argue whether these salted butter rituals were comedic entertainment or serious palate resets. You catch the low note of a horn and a deep-voiced skald stands reciting lines of praise to Odin, his words weaving the hall in an electric hush. Then with a single stomp he signals release and laughter erupts. Horns of mead clink, spilling droplets across benches. Some serving hands sprinkle rows of shallow wooden dishes with snow shavings, each crowned with a dab of wild honey. You scoop one to your lips, tasting the interplay of cold, sweet, and sticky textures, the nearest you've felt to an ancestral honey snow sundae. Historians still argue whether these honey snow dishes were sacred offerings to gods, or simply ingenious crowd pleasers. Between courses, the faithful pass a deep trough of ice-cold whey, thick and slightly tangy, laced with smashed barberries. It's a strange but refreshing palate note, and you recall that whey was often discarded after cheese making. A mainstream fact, but here it's repurposed as an impromptu frozen sherbet. Fringe scholars suggest that these troughs inspired later medieval fever remedies, spooned from ice as tonic, though direct evidence is elusive. Historians still argue whether Norse healers truly endorsed whey slush or if the idea was a scribal joke. Suddenly a platter arrives. The crowd parts to reveal a low stone slab bearing blackened iron bowls filled with what looks like dark, glistening goo. You lean forward and inhale the scent of smoked venison, then dip your spoon in. The smoked cream stew is a creamy mash of melted skyr and spiced broth, ladled over ice chips stolen from the cellar. It's salty and tangy, hot and cold in haphazard harmony. The hall erupts in oohs and ahs, and someone shouts, "That's ice cream worthy of Freya herself." A modern aside: if you've ever recoiled at the word savory ice cream, remember your Viking feast as the possible original flavor avant-garde. Historians still argue whether this dish was a one-time novelty or a cornerstone of feast menu. The evening crescendos with the traditional mead drinking contest. A massive wooden boar's head sits at the center of the table, It's more stuffed with mead-soaked berries. Each participant must pluck a berry from its snout and toss it smack into a bowl of snow without using their hand. You join in, feeling the cold grit under your fingers, and miss spectacularly, hurling a berry that clatters against the wall. The crowd roars as you fumble, then slide a bowl of snowy mead into your lap. You laugh until your sides ache, tasting the sharp, chilled mead as it drips across your thighs. Historians still argue whether these berry toss games were meant to honor fertility gods, or to sober up drinkers mid-symbol. Later, when you're nearly stuffed on salted fish and honey bars, the hall dims and torchlight flickers lower. A hush falls as the chieftain summons his steward, who emerges with a silver tray bearing tall, narrow drinking horns filled with an opaque, creamy liquid. You tilt your horn back in unison. A single swallow reveals a sweet, fatty liquor, likely a blend of warm cream and mead chilled by snow crystals. It warms your throat, then chills your belly in a delicious contradiction. Fringe tales speak of this concoction as Jotun's frost, a magical brew so potent it left drinkers slurring runes. Historians still argue whether Jotun's frost existed or was poetic license in skaldic verse. The feast winds down. Revelers lean back against wall tapestries depicting legendary battles, cheeks flushed, breaths shallow from laughter and mead. You watch as servants sweep glowing embers from the hearth and carry out the last of the ice pits, covering them with straw for morning preservation. One lad, emboldened by drink, attempts to carve an ice sculpture of Thor's hammer with a broken antler. His efforts yield more shards than shape, sending ice chips skittering across the boards. You chuckle, recalling your own childhood snowman disaster. A playful thought drifts through. Maybe Viking TikTok would feature longhouse fails. By the time you stagger out into the night air, the festival torches guttering low, you taste the lingering mix of smoky ribs, chilled creams, honey and berry. That sensory tapestry lingers like the echo of a distant lullaby. Even if the frozen elements at these feasts weren't silky smooth scoops, the Norse knew how to weave cold into celebration. It wasn't just about sustenance but about novelty, camaraderie and the shared thrill of biting into something that bit back. You trudge back to your sleeping quarters, the echoes of laughter trailing behind you, and feel a warm glow in your chest that has nothing to do with meat. You've seen how ice, snow and dairy merged with Viking feast culture, from honey snow treats to chili shrimp cocktails of Barbary Way. Historians still argue whether these traditions influenced medieval European courts or died out with the sagas, but as you climb into your fur-lined bed, you carry their echoes into sleep. A final jest drifts in. Picture a Viking travel blogger reviewing feast halls. 4-5 stars, great ambiance, ice shards a bit rough, but 10/10 for authenticity. You snort softly, feeling the world spin gently as you sink beneath fur. The crackle of embers seems to echo across centuries, and you let it lull you into dreams of ice-dusted horns and honeyed snow. You slip quietly from the longhouse's warm glow into a salt-scented dawn, the horizon streaked with pale pink as fishing sails bob on the fjord. Today, you're tracking the lifeblood of Viking frozen treats, trade routes and exotic imports. Picture yourself cradling a horn of chilled cream as you board a now bound for distant shores, because without salt, spices and imported ingredients, your frosty dessert dreams would have fizzled before they ever formed. Mainstream historians confirm that Vikings sailed far beyond Scandinavia, linking northern Europe to the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate through a web of rivers and seas. They loaded amber, furs and even human cargo onto longships, returning with salt from Iberia, exotic spices like cumin and coriander, and according to some accounts, rare sugar crystals. You can almost taste that coarse salt, briny and mineral-rich, licked off your fingertips as it dissolves into a bowl of snowy cream, sharpening sweetness and softening ice crystals in one clever trick. Historians still argue whether Vikings used salt to create brine-cooled mixtures for faster freezing, or simply hoarded it for preserving fish. But the idea of salted ice invigorates your imagination. You lean against the rail, feeling the deck rock beneath your boots, and breathe in the heady aroma of resinous pine wood, mingled with the tang of cured herring. Off the starboard side, amphorae of imported olive oil and vinegary garum sway in their crates, unlikely ingredients for ice cream perhaps, but signaling the reach of Norse mercantilism. A quirky tidbit: A marginal note in a 10th century Icelandic manuscript mentions buckets of snow sweetened with foreign sugar, suggesting that a wealthy merchant might have sprinkled sugar lumps into cream before freezing. Historians still argue whether sugar ever made landfall in Viking settlements, or remained a myth penned by scribes puzzling over unfamiliar granules. As the ship glides past rocky islets, you recall the salt from the salt pans of Brittany harvested by Gallic artisans and traded in bulk to Viking ports. This sea salt, coarser than modern table stuff, packed into leather sacks, was prized not only for curing meat, but for seasoning dishes and possibly for mineral-tinged desserts. Imagine dipping a wooden spoon into a chilled bowl of berry-laced cream and watching those salt crystals catch the lamplight before melting into tangy sweetness. You press a crystal between your teeth. The brine tickles your tongue, amplifying every wild berry note. Historians still argue whether salt-laced cream was a deliberate flavor hack or an accidental byproduct of preservation supplies. Trade also brought saffron threads, trading hands all the way from Spain to Constantinople and back northward. Fringe culinary enthusiasts argue that Viking elites might have powdered saffron into mead or cream, tinting it a golden hue and lending floral complexity. You close your eyes and swirl bright yellow streaks through slushy cream, inhaling notes of hay and honey. Historians still argue whether saffron ice treats ever moved beyond the realm of fanciful sagas into actual recipes, but the image sparkles like sunlight on water. Under awnings of tanned hide, merchants barter wares from distant lands, glass beads, Byzantine coins and small sacks of cumin seeds. You finger a handful of cumin, crushing it between calloused fingers. Its warm, earthy aroma rises like smoke from a campfire. Some say Vikings ground cumin into mead and cream slush for its digestive benefits after feasting. Historians still argue whether such spiced slurries were medicinal tonics, or just fringe experiments by curious cooks, but you let the scent dance in your nostrils. Beyond spices and salts there were metals. Small bronze cauldrons perfect for chilling mixtures over snow. These cauldrons, traded from Frankish workshops, held snow cream slurries in their shallow bowls, preventing thin ice from sticking. You lift one to your lips, its metal edge dented from countless voyages, and sip a nip of chilled cream. The sensation is electric, a contrast of smooth dairy and granular froth. Mainstream sources note that metal cookware accelerated freezing by conducting cold, a principle still used in modern frozen dessert machines. A modern aside drifts by: if you've ever salted your watermelon or sprinkled kosher salt atop vanilla gelato, you're reviving Viking pragmatism. They may not have had Instagram reels to display their hacks, but their salted treats would have been no less revolutionary. Imagine a Viking influencer posting salt and snow cream, educating fellow Jarls on 3 ways to amplify your slush. You descend at a trading post, wooden palisades echoing with foreign tongues, Slavic, Gaelic and Arabic. Here barrels of rosewater arrive, distilled in Syrian bazaars. Fringe gastronomes argue that rosewater could have been drizzled into icy dairy for a perfumed finish. You taste a drop, delicate, floral, a whisper of gardens beneath desert skies. Historians still argue whether rosewater cream ever graced a Viking table or remained confined to the courts of Baghdad, but the notion feels almost too sumptuous to resist. On dusty shelves you spot small chests of black pepper and cinnamon spices coveted enough to feature in skaldic poetry. You imagine a daring cook sprinkling crackling pepper into berry snow slush, adding a warming bite to cold sweetness. Historians still argue whether peppered ices were fringe novelties or genuine recipes, but the spicy-cool juxtaposition gives you chills both from temperature and intrigue. As the market hustles around you, you recall that Vikings imported not only flavorings but structural ingredients: small sacks of sugar soaked into pine cones for transport, candied lentils glazed with honey to survive long winters. Fringe lore tells of a confection called amber candy, sugar-coated pine resin, which might have been melted into snow to create crystalline sweetness. Historians still argue whether any of these candied resins were ever used in ice desserts or if they belonged purely in mead halls. You leave the busy quay, heading back through salt marshes toward the farmstead. Your pockets carry a few precious grains, salt crystals, saffron dust, and a shard of cane sugar. At home you sift the sugar into a bowl of cream and snow, swirl in a pinch of saffron and stir with a polished antlertine. The brine-sweet mixture crackles with micro-ice as it chills, the spices dissolving into a creamy golden slurry. You scoop a spoonful and sense the convergence of worlds, the bracing chill from your homeland's ice pits, the warmth of Persian saffron, the earthy hum of cumin, and the briny uplift of sea salt. It's not silky gelato, it's a coarse rustic tapestry of flavors that speaks of daring voyages and boundless curiosity. Historians still argue whether such cross-cultural frozen desserts formed a true chapter in Viking culinary history or remained tantalizing possibilities sketched in the margins of saga. A light jest drifts through. Picture a Viking travel brochure boasting "Taste the Empire, try our saffron salt snow cream." You grin at the thought, the edges of sleep encroaching like an incoming tide. The blend of spices and salts lingers on your tongue as you drift back toward the longhouse, carrying the taste of trade routes and distant markets. As you slip beneath your furs, you realize that no single sweetener or spice defined Viking frozen treats. It was their spirit of exchange, of gathering the world's flavors to transform simple snow and cream. In that alchemy, the seeds of modern ice cream were sown one cargo hold at a time. You slip out of the longhouse before dawn's first light, the sky a gauzy veil of lavender, and follow a narrow trail that winds toward an ancient burial mound, crowned with weathered runestones. Tonight, you're chasing those elusive whispers in the sagas, hints of chilled desserts that never made it into the mainstream cookbooks. You press your palm against a mossy stone and imagine the hands of skalds, centuries ago, scratching quill into vellum about snow-sweetened cream. It feels like decoding a half-forgotten secret, one that could reshape everything you thought you knew about Viking cuisine. Mainstream scholars agree the sagas blend fact with fiction, and while they brim with heroic deeds, they're surprisingly scant on recipes. Yet you find tantalizing nuggets. One passage in the 13th century Njál's saga mentions a chieftain offering his guests frosted whey during a midsummer feast, a dessert so strange it lingers in your mind like a half-remembered dream. Historians still argue whether frosted whey refers to a slushy mixture of whey and snow, or is simply poetic flourish to convey chill and hospitality. But it's the kind of clue you crave. You trace the path past leaning oaks, their moss-draped branches whispering above you, and recall a quirky tidbit from the Laxdæla saga. The young Jarl's bride supposedly tricked her mother-in-law by hiding snow in a wicker basket, serving chilled cream as divine ambrosia to unsuspecting guests. The text goes on to describe guests shivering with delight at each spoonful, as though tasting the breath of the glacier itself. Fringe researchers love to cite this as proof Vikings had a primitive snow cream dessert, but mainstream critics caution the anecdote reads more like a dramatic device, a metaphor for cold-heartedness than a cooking manual. Historians still argue whether this story preserves a real practice, or if it's merely saga-style hyperbole. You continue up the rise, the smell of damp earth mingling with pine resin, and imagine that wicker basket straw woven tight around a hidden cache of snow, waiting to spring into action when cream was poured. You almost hear the bride's suppressed giggle, a modern echo of clandestine culinary experimentation. A fringe theory even speculates that Norse cooks used sheepskin bags filled with snow to rapidly chill whey, mimicking ice bath techniques, centuries ahead of French sorbet masters. No physical evidence survives, but you let the notion swirl in your mind like powdered sugar in milk. Pausing at a runestone marked with faded carvings of wolves and knotwork, you read the inscription aloud. May your halls be warm, your feasts plentiful, your lids be heavy with sleep, and your cups be cold. That last phrase, you realize, could be a toast to chilled drinks or frozen desserts. A mainstream fact, toasts in Viking society often invoked wishes of abundance and well-being, but you wonder if cold cups ever literally meant snow-chilled cream. Historians still argue whether seasonal chill references in toasts are symbolic or describe actual practices, but you savor the possibility. Your path curves toward a small clearing where aged timbers mark the footprint of a long-vanished homestead. Locals call it the Frost Table Site, After a 17th century chronicle that recounts travelers finding wooden tables littered with snow beneath peels of cutting board. The chronicle claims the residents used natural ice ladders to chill substances put upon the table, though whether those substances were fish, meat, or dairy is unclear. Fringe archaeologists propose that these frost tables were communal dessert stations, set up for festival days when cream was whipped, mixed with honey, and frozen into discs for speedy scoop. Historians still argue whether frost tables were engineered for food preservation only, or doubled as impromptu ice cream parlors. You kneel beside a collapsed stone pillar, imagining the crash of timbers and the bustle of feast preparation. A quirky local tale likely born in the 1800s claims that a traveling priest once described seeing ladles of sweet cream dipped in snow at a midwinter gathering. He supposedly wrote, "No priest before me has tasted such divine frost, nor shall I again until the last day." Scholars debate whether that priest's diary entry is authentic or a later addition to enhance local folklore, but it's that sense of mystery that keeps your curiosity alive. Up ahead, a crumbling turf circle marks a forgotten snow pit site. You prod the sodden edge with a stick and uncover a layer of granular ice beneath. Remnants of centuries-old snow that survived thanks to peat insulation. A chill rises through the soil as if demanding you acknowledge how cleverly Vikings harnessed Earth's cold. You scrape a bit of that ancient ice and press it to your lips. Nothing remains of the original cream, but you taste history itself. Historians still argue whether such pits ever hosted sweet experiments, or were strictly utilitarian preservers of meat and butter. But here you stand in the liminal space between myth and reality. Night deepens and the moon climbs over the tree. You settle on a flat stone and lean back, wrapping your cloak tight. Fringe gastronome Geraldson posits that Norse poets embedded hidden culinary codes in saga language, words like frostmorn or ice shroud, indicating secret recipes understood only by elite cooks. According to him, only the initiated knew that ice shroud meant a blend of whipped cream and snow, served in shallow bowls carved from elk antlers. Mainstream academics dismiss this decoding as fanciful reproach, arguing there's no consistent linguistic pattern. Historians still argue whether saga metaphors conceal literal practices or simply evoke vivid imagery. You close your eyes and imagine a clandestine midnight gathering of jarls and their cooks. Light footfalls on packed snow as they carry bowls of snow and cream to the mound's summit. Perhaps they raised horns in ritual to the frost giants, praising the chill that granted them the luxury of frozen treats. Or maybe they simply laughed at mortal limitations, scooping slush like children at play. The fringe theory feels romantic, but the absence of physical proof leaves you suspended between possibility and skepticism. A whisper of wind rustles the grass and you sense the sagas themselves watching you. Their verses hold a dream of frozen cream, an echo that transcends practicality. Maybe those hints in the texts were never recipes but invitations to imagine, to taste the impossible. As you lift your own empty spoon to the sky, you toast the silent poets who dreamt up frost amidst fire-lit feast. You rise, brushing soil from your knees, and head back to the longhouse, carrying only your questions and the memory of ruined stones under moonlight. Fringe theories and saga whispers swirl together, forming a tapestry richer than any single fact. You settle on your pallet, the hush of midnight pressing in, and feel the thrill of unsolved mysteries tug at the edge of sleep. Historians still argue whether any of these saga tidbits point to real Viking ice creams or if they're simply poetic frostings on more prosaic meat. But for tonight you drift on that uncertainty, tasting the promise of chill and sweetness as you slip into dream. You wake to pale dawn, leaking through a crack in the longhouse wall, the scent of damp straw and last night's embers still lingering as you stretch and recall every icy taste you've chased so far. Now you stand in the hall's center, arms crossed, ready to tackle the scholarly fray. Did Vikings actually have ice cream, or is the idea a delightful mirage? Historians still argue whether the evidence points to genuine frozen desserts or simply to myth and fancy. And tonight, you're straddling that debate like a shield maiden on a battering ram. On one side of the mead table sit proponents of the yes camp, waving their rubicund mugs and citing the Norse love of dairy, snow pits and sagas whispering of frost-laced treats. A mainstream fact anchors their case. Archaeological digs around Greenland settlements have uncovered stratified snow pit remains and dairy storage cellars attesting to advanced preservation methods. Clear signs Vikings understood how to harvest and store ice far beyond mere meat curing needs. They argue that if you can store butter in a straw-lined pit, you can store cream too, and your modern freezer owes an iced nod to these Iron Age innovators. Historians still argue whether storing ice was a purely utilitarian act or the first step toward desert ambitions. But the raw infrastructure existed. Swinging to the no side, skeptics point out that despite these cellars, no Viking cookbook or runic inscription spells out a recipe for ice cream, and no intact wooden scoop, labeled official jarl use only, has ever surfaced. They note that most saga references to snow simply employ it as poetic atmosphere. The bride's breath was cold as the glacier, rather than concrete culinary instruction. Historians still argue whether metaphorical language in medieval texts can be taken literally, a debate echoing louder than a berserker's war cry. After all, if sagas mention feasts in exquisite detail, boar's head here, mead-flavored ale there, why omit a truly novel frozen treat? The silence, they say, speaks volumes. You pace between these two camps, imagining a courtroom drama on the bench. Stoic jarls weigh evidence. On either side, bards recite saga passages, each claiming to have uncovered hidden recipes in metaphor. A quirky tidbit in this scholarly comedy: in 1823, an antiquarian named Olaf Eriksson proclaimed he'd found a jarl's diary describing ice-churned cream, only to have it reclassified as probable poetic license decades later. The lost diary, now presumably turned into Yndling, could have settled the matter if only Vikings had invented fireproof parchment. Let's break down the main arguments in favor. Ingredients and infrastructure. Vikings had dairy herds aplenty, access to snow pits and ice cellars. Remember that underground chamber from section 4, and honey and berries for flavor. It's like having flour, eggs and sugar but no oven. Surely at least one home chef would have improvised. Saga references. Njal's Saga's Frosted Way, Laxdale's Basket of Snow prank, and fringe notes about frozen rose lace all hint at snow dairy experiment. Even if metaphorical, the recurring frost imagery suggests a cultural awareness of chilling techniques. Parallel cultures. Contemporary Persians and Chinese were crafting sorbets and ice tarts by the 9th century, so Vikings trading along those same routes could have picked up chilling methods. Historians still argue whether knowledge transfer along the Silk Road extended to dessert recipes. On the flip side, skeptics underscore Gite, lack of direct recipes. No saga spells out, take cream, mix with snow, stir thrice, serve, an absence of evidence in monastic kitchens where scribes meticulously documented recipes raises doubt. Climatic constraints. While snow pits worked in winter, securing enough clean snow in unpredictable springs and autumns would have been a logistical nightmare, limiting frozen desserts to rare ceremonies, if at all. Cultural priorities. Vikings prized hearty sustenance and quick energy. A dessert that melted faster than you could eat it might have seemed frivolous. Historians still argue whether such luxury treats fit Norse pragmatism. You sniff at your own reflection in a polished horn mirror tinged with a faint frost halo from last night's experiments, and picture a Viking chef furrowing their brow, asking, "Is this worth the effort?" Meanwhile, fringe enthusiasts offer that perhaps the elite jarls with more hands to tend snow pits indulged in occasional snow cream, while commoners stuck to warm porridges. Historians still argue whether any culinary divide mirrored the Norse social hierarchy. A modern aside flickers through your mind. If you've ever seen ice cream trucks at Renaissance fairs, you know novelty trumps authenticity, and Vikings might have staged frosty spectacles as showmanship rather than genuine dessert culture. Maybe snow cream was the ancient equivalent of deep-fried butter sticks at state fairs, more performance than sustenance. Between sips of lingering mead, you recall that some monks in medieval Iceland kept recipe manuscripts. None mention chilling dairy, suggesting that if ice cream did exist, it remained unrecorded in ecclesiastical settings. Historians still argue whether culinary knowledge flowed freely between monastic and secular kitchens, or was jealously guarded by household cooks. You step outside, the hall's chatter receding to distant echoes, and stand beneath the star-flecked sky. A gust of wind stirs loose snow from the roof's eaves, sending a swirl of crystals dancing at your feet, an ephemeral reminder of just how fleeting frozen wonders can be. You stoop, cup your hand and let snowflakes melt on your tongue, imagining a swirl of cream mixed in, silky smooth, and poof, gone, like a dream at dawn. Joke time. Picture a Viking blogger posting top 5 snow recipes with frost goals, only to have trolls comment, "Where's the recipe for hot stew?" Priorities. Or imagine Thor shaking his head at you, booming, "If I wanted cold, I'd ride my chariot through a blizzard." You grin, letting the absurdity ease you. Ultimately, the debate circles back to one undeniable truth. Vikings mastered cold storage and had the raw materials for ice cream. Yet tangible proof remains as elusive as a fox in the snow. Was ice cream a Norse invention, or simply an idea they flirted with? Historians still argue whether the scattered clues align into a coherent picture, or sparkle only as isolated possibilities. You lean against the longhouse's wooden post, the morning chill seeping through your tunic, and let the uncertainty settle in like a gentle lullaby. Perhaps the Vikings did taste something we'd call ice cream, or perhaps we're stretching metaphors into reality. Either way, the debate itself is a testament to human curiosity. And isn't that the sweetest thing of all? As you drift back inside, the flicker of torchlight guiding your steps, you carry this contradiction in your pocket, the possibility of ice cream, and the reality of an unanswered question. Historians still argue whether Viking ice cream was a noble truth, or a fool's dream, but for tonight, you choose to savor the mystery. You wake to a crisp morning where the horizon is painted in pale apricot, and frost still lingers on the thatched roof above you. In this land of extremes, the seasons hold the power of life and scarcity, and they shaped every frozen experiment you might imagine. Winters here stretch long as sagas, with days that barely stir between dawn and dusk. Summers flare in a sunlit burst, offering brief abundance before plunging back into chill. Your breath puffs in the air as you step outside, ready to explore how Scandinavian climate and seasonal rhythms governed the Vikings' mastery of ice and dairy. In winter, the world is a quiet white cathedral. Snow covers fields, rivers freeze into glass, and every household might harvest ice directly from the frozen fjord. Mainstream climate studies confirm that medieval Norse regions experienced what's called the Little Ice Age precursor, a cooling trend from roughly the 10th to 12th centuries that made winters harsher and summers shorter. You press a boot into the snow and hear a satisfying crack, recalling the river ice harvesting technique from Section 4, chiseling thick slabs with iron picks and hauling them on sleds back to underground cellars. Historians still argue whether this colder period enhanced ice storage longevity or made year-round dairy survival too precarious. But you can't deny how the relentless frost offered both challenge and opportunity. As you trudge toward a frozen inlet, your hood nearly obscuring the glint of ice, you imagine how these long winters shaped everyday life. Dairy herds were stalled in barns, sheltered from blizzards that raged out. Farmers fed cows a diet of stored hay, ensuring milk continued to flow even when fields slept under deep snow. Mainstream zooarchaeological evidence shows that Norse farms strategically dried and stored fodder to extend milking seasons through winter months. You glimpse a barn door cracked open to reveal bales of grass stacked high, each one a lifeline for butter and fresh milk. Historians still argue whether this winter feeding sustained high enough milk yields to support feasts of frozen treats, or merely secured basic survival. One quirky tidbit: in some northern settlements, villagers practiced midnight churning, a ritual timed to the darkest hours when ambient temperatures fell lowest. They'd bring churns outside at midnight, working the leather bags until butter solidified faster in the biting cold. Legend says that on the solstice, churning at the darkest hour produced the finest, creamiest butter and possibly the purest cream for primitive ice cream. Historians still argue whether this midnight timing was a widespread tradition or the product of romantic folklore, but you savor the image of pale-faced farmers twirling churns under aurora-lit sky. By late winter, snow depth reached as high as your chest in some valleys, and people carved tunnels and pits into drifts for storage. You navigate to one such snow dome, where villagers deposit fresh snow daily. These communal snowbanks, insulated by pine boughs and straw, offered a ready source of clean ice shards through spring. A mainstream fact, dendrochronological records and historical references indicate that some communities maintained snow domes well into May, even June. That extended chill meant that by the time milk was flowing high in late spring, ice was still on hand in many cellars. Historians still argue whether these snow domes were primarily for preserving fish and meat, or whether enterprising cooks actually harvested scoops for creamy concoction. When summer finally arrives, it does so in a rush of green growth. The midnight sun stretches evenings into endless twilight. Wild herbs and berries burst forth on hillsides. Pasture land ripples with newborn lambs and calves. You wander through a meadow dotted with buttercups, the air thick with buzzing bees. Here, dairy yields peaked, and cream richness swelled. Mainstream agrarian studies show that spring and early summer milk can contain up to 50% more fat than in autumn. Thanks to lush grazing, an ideal window for preparing rich cream. You dip your fingers into tall grass scented with thyme and imagine mixing that milky bounty with fresh snow. Snapshots of primitive sorbet in the making. Historians still argue whether this seasonal abundance spurred short-lived frozen treats, or was simply noted but not acted upon by busy farmers. A modern aside flickers. Think of how your local dairy farm ramps up ice cream production each spring. Vikings, in essence, did the same without industrial machinery. They rode that fat-rich spring wave to churn butter and whip cream, possibly diverting a portion into chill experiments before the snow pits emptied. You recall the stone slab ice plates described in Section 4, where villagers spread cream and berry mixtures to freeze in thin sheets, scraping them off like ancient granite. That technique only worked when days were just warm enough to soften the mixture against the cold slab, then cold enough to refreeze it, a narrow seasonal sweet spot. Then comes midsummer's feast, when ice is scarcer but prized. You picture a Giles steward journeying at dawn to harvest the last blocks from a cellar, dodging drips of meltwater. On feast day, the steward pries open a sealed ice pit, revealing precious chunks packed in straw. They're presented like treasure, each block worth more than a sack of grain. A quirky detail: one saga recounts a steward dropping a block and dashing away in terror, fearing the Jarl's wrath more than a rival warrior's sword. Historians still argue whether this anecdote signals the value placed on ice or is theatrical embellishment, but it underscores how integral seasonal ice was to status and celebration. As August sun wanes, dairy yields dip and ice domes dwindle. You recall gatherings in late summer where villagers toasted the passing of ice, a bittersweet acknowledgement that the season for frozen treats would soon close. Yet they found creative substitutions. Snow harvested in spring might be mixed with leftover whey to create a cooling beverage, echoing the frosted whey of Section 8. That thicker, tangy drink served as a farewell to summer's warmth, a last taste of frost before it vanished. Historians still argue whether these late summer whey slushes were remedial tonics or merely opportunistic refreshers under limited cold reserves. Come autumn, winds howl and temperatures slip again, and the cycle begins anew. You watch farmers harvest ice from rivers for the coming winter, stacking blocks in newly dug cellars, relishing the prospect of next year's chill. Mainstream environmental reconstructions show that late autumn provided abundant ice, but posed risks. Early thaws could spoil harvests, and warming periods might collapse cellars if not insulated properly. You touch the moss-covered wall of an ice cellar, feeling the cold radiate through. It's a delicate balance between Earth's fickle climate and human ingenuity. You lean against a fence post, inhaling the aroma of dried hay and wood smoke, and let the season's pulse lull you. The Vikings lived at nature's mercy, and the extremes of dark winters and blinding summers defined their culinary possibility. If they indulged in something we'd call ice cream, it sprang from this rhythm: harvest and preserve in winter, experiment in spring, celebrate in summer, mourn its loss in autumn. A final playful thought drifts through your mind. Imagine a Viking weather forecast. Expect snow through May, with a chance of cream. Summer, endless sun, berries and runny butter. fall harvest your ice folk. You chuckle at the absurdity, feeling your eyelids droop like frost-laden branches. The scent of earth and ice, of milky warmth and cool abundance, intertwines as you drift toward dream. Historians still argue whether these seasonal nuances led to genuine frozen desserts, or if they simply molded a vivid culinary backdrop for survival. But one thing's certain, the Vikings danced with their climate, from the deepest freeze to the brightest sun, and in that dance lies the heart of every possible scoop. You slip through the pre-dawn mist toward a field scattered with low grassy mounds, each marking the silent graves of long-dead Vikings. In the pale light, you kneel beside a recently unearthed pit where archaeologists have recovered ornate wooden tubs and broken shards of glazed pottery, clues that whisper of dairy rituals and chilling experiments. You brush away damp soil from a bent wood container, its ribs still faintly visible, and imagine it cradling fresh cream, destined for a snowy slush rather than cheese. Mainstream excavations confirm that bentwood tubs were ubiquitous in Norse households for milking and storage, but these particular vessels bear unusual scorch marks, and residue tests reveal traces of lipids consistent with dairy fat, evidence that Vikings might have heated, cooled, and refrozen cream in ways beyond mere butter production. You press your fingertips to the inside of the tub, feeling the faint ridges shaped by steam bending, and inhale the earthy scent of peat that once filled this grave. Fringe researchers argue that the scorch marks indicate these tubs were used over smoldering embers to thicken cream, before cooling it rapidly in snow, producing a grainy frozen treat. Historians still argue whether these heat and cold cycles served culinary purposes, or were part of ritual purification rites. After all, cremation and feasting often intertwined in Norse funerary customs. But as you tilt the tub and catch a drop of rainwater mixing with ancient fats, you can almost taste a hint of those early ice creams. Nearby, a rusted iron ring emerges, a simple hoop that fits snugly around a wooden churn's neck. Mainstream scholars note that such rings stabilized churns during vigorous rocking, yet this one is broader and heavier than usual, suggesting it might have doubled as a weight to press whey from curds, or to compact snow around a cream-filled vessel. You imagine setting a smaller bentwood tub inside a larger barrel, packing the gap with snow, and using the iron ring as a lid to keep it sealed. That pressure would allow cream to freeze more evenly, a rudimentary precursor to the hand-crank churn. Historians still argue whether Vikings invented this double-barrel freezing method, or if it was borrowed from neighboring Baltic tribes, but the overlapping designs hint at cross-cultural ingenuity. Your gaze drifts to a cluster of flint tools lying nearby. Scrapers, chisels, and a handful of flint flakes, a quirky tidbit. Some allege these were used not just for butchery or hide preparation, but for shaving blocks of ice into fine granules. You pick up a triangular scraper and rub it against your thumb. It feels impossibly sharp. Picture a cook at a midsummer feast, hunched over a snow pit, using flint to shave ice into a bowl of spiced cream, whispering incantations learned from healer wives. Snow, meet cream, freeze like winter's dream. Historians still argue whether flint tools were ever pressed into this service or remained purely for leatherwork, but you tuck a flake into your pouch for luck. Deeper in the trench, you uncover the rim of a glazed ceramic bowl, thin-walled and darkened by centuries of peat smoke. Analysis shows traces of honey and berries, garnering excitement among dig teams. They theorize that this bowl once held a berry-infused cream that was dipped into snow for instant chilling. You tap the rim with a gloved knuckle, and the hollow ring echoes across the silent field. It's not much, but it's enough to conjure the ritual sheep's wool blankets draped over the bowl to catch melting snow, wooden spoons stirring until frost crystals form. Historians still argue whether ceramic vessels were safe for direct contact with snow and ice, or if rapid cooling would crack them. But the idea of multi-material techniques electrifies your imagination. Behind a line of protective markers, the lead archaeologist brushes at a mound to reveal a cluster of animal bones bound with iron hoops, a small barrel-shaped cage. This mini-barrel, as she calls it, fits neatly in a cooking hearth, and could have been used to chill dairy over embers, alternating heating and cooling cycles in a single vessel. You crouch to inspect the charred edges and notice microscopic striations, signs the barrel was rotated while contents tumbled inside. Fringe scholars suggest this was an early agitation method to break up ice crystals, creating a smoother texture akin to stirring a modern ice cream custard. Historians still argue whether Vikings practiced such culinary sophistication, or were satisfied with coarse slush, but the precision of these grooves hints at deliberate repeated motion. You stand and wipe your boots on the grass, glancing towards stacks of peat bricks where smoke once curled upward. Near one stack lies a carved antler tine scored with notches. At first glance it seems a mundane tool, but residue analysis shows traces of dairy protein. You run your fingers along the notches and imagine using this antler as a scoop and stirrer, paddling cream through snow until it thickens. That antler tine callback surfaces from section 3, where goats' horns mixed milk in wooden pail. Now you see a specialized implement, an ice cream paddle, evidence of task-specific utensils. Historians still argue whether antlers were fashioned for culinary chores or simply repurposed farm tools, but the wear patterns suggest repeated dipping into cold mixture. Beyond the pit, a wooden trough lies half buried beneath turf, its staves bowed from the earth's pressure. This trough matches descriptions of ice larders from coastal settlements, yet residue tests reveal a mix of fish oils and dairy fats, a perplexing combination. Some propose that fish oil sealed the wood against melting ice, while cream chilled within. Others say it's accidental from storing salted fish alongside butter. Historians still argue whether such mixed-use containers reflect culinary daring or mere practicality, but the thought of briny fish oil protecting a vessel of cream feels like a Viking experiment gone delightfully rogue. As you follow the edge of the excavation toward a raised platform, you spot a line of small stone weights, flat pebbles perforated with holes for tying to string. Mainstream interpretations view these as loom weights or fishing net sinkers, yet some archaeologists note matching weight patterns found near known dairy processing sites. Could these stones have secured snow-filled bags around cream barrels, maintaining contact for even cooling? Historians still argue whether net sinkers ever moonlighted as ice-press tools, but you can't unsee the possibility of string-bound snow sacks layered around a churn. Your heart quickens as you reach the core of the site, a cylindrical stone block carved with circular channel. The archaeologist explains that when fitted with a wooden cask, the stone block created a press. Applied downward force could press whey from curds, or if packed with snow, hold cream against cold surfaces. You trace the concentric grooves with your fingertip, marveling at the precision. A jokey aside bubbles to mind. Imagine a Viking home kitchen with stone-cold press, now with extra frost. You chuckle softly, feeling the thrill of discovery. You stand beneath grey skies, the wind brushing across the field like an exhalation from the pub. Tools, vessels and weighty stones, each shard and splinter hint at culinary curiosity, at the possibility that Vikings did more than just store dairy. They played with temperature, texture and taste. Historians still argue whether these archaeological clues add up to true ice cream production, or simply showcase ingenuity in food preservation. But as you pocket a small flint scraper and dust off your knees, you feel closer to the truth than ever. You trudge back toward the longhouse, the excavation receding behind you, and carry these fragments of history like treasure. Sleep calls you now, promising dreams of spinning churns, snow-packed tubs and creamy slushes beneath northern lights. Though unanswered questions swirl like snowflakes, you rest in the certainty that Vikings left behind more than armor and axes. They left the seeds of frozen delight buried in the earth itself. You awaken to the echo of distant chanting carried on a cold breeze, stepping into the open courtyard where torchlight flickers against the carved dragon prow of a longship beached on silver sands. Tonight, you'll chase the threads of myth and legend, those tales spun by scolds that might hide whispers of icy refreshments among gods and mortals. So wander with me beneath the starlit sky, where every saga becomes a lacquered mirror, reflecting both truth and wonder. First, a mainstream fact to anchor you. In the prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson describes Aegir's hall beneath the sea, where the waves foam like frothy mead and giant vats of ale bubble eternally. While no text explicitly mentions frozen desserts in that hall, The imagery of churning foam, white, cold, effervescent, evokes a texture not unlike slushy cream. Historians still argue whether Aegir's brewing metaphors hint at an early understanding of frothing and cooling techniques, or remain purely poetic flourish. You drift along the shoreline toward a circle of standing stones, each etched with knotwork and rune. One stone bears the image of Freya pouring from a horn that seems to drip crystalline droplets. A quirky tidbit from a 9th century skald suggests that Freya's horn Brisingamen once overflowed not with mead but with frozen nectar, gifted by frost giants. A gift that could soothe even the weariest warrior. Historians still argue whether this is a genuine mythic reference to a frosty brew or a later embellishment to enhance Freya's allure. But the thought of divine snow cream swirling in a goddess's goblet sends a pleasant chill down your spine. A meandering path leads you beneath a curtain of willow branches, their tips dipping in a shallow pool. Legend says that the water here was once the tears of Loki's mother, frozen by Odin's wrath into crystal pools that never thaw. You imagine dipping a birch bark cup into the pool, scooping up chilled tears that taste of salt and sorrow, perhaps an inspiration for Norse cooks to glean the essence of cold. A mainstream fact, Nordic folklore often links water bodies to elemental forces, suggesting communities revered ice as much as fire. Historians still argue whether these emotional water myths reflect actual ice harvesting practices, or simply serve as moral allegory. Your boots crunch on frost-hardened grass as you reach a small shrine to Skadi, the Jotun of winter and hunting. An offering bowl carved from reindeer antler sits empty, but folklore journals record that pilgrims left mixtures of mead and berries in the bowl, expecting them to freeze overnight as an offering to Skadi's icy domain. A quirky fringe tale claims a 14th century Icelandic priest witnessed such an offering freeze so solid it shattered when struck by his staff, a sign that Skadi accepted the tribute. Historians still argue whether this tale stems from genuine witness accounts or ecclesiastical skepticism coloring pagan practices, but you can almost taste the firm berry-streaked ice as you trace the shrine's rim with your fingertip. Beyond the shrine stands a twisting yew tree whose roots cradle a hidden cavern. According to local legend, heroes who passed through its mouth were gifted with visions of the underworld, where rivers of frozen cream flowed beneath layers of ice. While no saga describes such rivers literally, the concept mirrors descriptions of Hell's realm, a cold, misty place where souls wander under frosted sky. A mainstream fact, Norse cosmology places Hell in a realm of chill and gloom, reinforcing a cultural fascination with cold as both peril and preservative. Historians still argue whether these cosmological images served practical meteorological education or were purely symbolic landscapes of morality. You follow a faint trail of orange moss toward a cliff ledge overlooking a roaring waterfall. Ancient poems hint that the waterfall's spray once crystallized instantly, when touched by Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, creating natural ice sculptures. Imagine scooping those shards into a horn, adding a drizzle of cloudberry mead to craft a celebratory frost for storm watches. A quirky detail, a 17th century folk song from Telemark sings of farmers gathering Thor's shards each spring as good luck charms, mixing them into whey for children's fever. Historians still argue whether such folk songs preserve genuine pre-Christian rites or reflect later farmhouse superstition, but the melodic lines linger in your ears as you peer over the precipice, picturing crystalline plumes tossed by lightning. Night deepens, and you find yourself at the foot of a low mound where an old chieftain's grave is said to lie. Local lore says that the chieftain's sword formed a frozen ring in winter streams, and villagers would shave off delicate ice curls to cool sweet porridges in his honor. A mainstream archaeological report confirms that some grave goods include iron blades buried with timber troughs, perhaps symbolic of both weapon and vessel. Historians still argue whether this confluence of martial and culinary objects indicates feasting rituals or political symbolism, but the image of ice curls as ceremonial adornment enchants your senses. You settle on a smooth boulder and sip from a wooden cup filled with a pale, frothy liquid. According to saga fragments, this was Freya's dew ambrosia cooled in snow pits and offered at dawn to bless the harvest. A quirky footnote in a medieval monastery register describes monks encountering Viking peasants carrying such cups, praising their incredibly refreshing quality. Historians still argue whether monastic records accurately captured pagan offerings or demonized them as heathen frivolities, but you relish the imagined aroma of honeyed cream kissed by dew and frost. A hush falls as you approach a ring of 9 birch poles entwined with elderberry vines, the legendary circle of winter's memory. Lore holds that on the longest night, the circle would exhale a ghostly mist of sweet-smelling vapor, perhaps the lingering aroma of fermented cream frozen and vaporized over hearth fires. A mainstream fact, many Norse rituals involved roasting offerings over open flames, creating aromatic smoke used in divination. Historians still argue whether the winter's memory ceremony ever produced edible vapors or if the mist was metaphorical for ancestral spirits returning home. Your path circles back toward the longhouse, but you pause at a lone runestone graven, with the image of a woman pouring from a jar into a bowl that seems rimmed with froth. Scholars debate whether this is a depiction of Sif, goddess of earth and harvest, conjuring rains of sweet milk, or a generic tribute to household bounty. A quirky interpretation by one antiquarian suggests the frost rim signifies a primitive rim freeze technique, pressing a bowl's lip into packed snow to form a decorative ice ring. Historians still argue whether artistic motifs convey practical methods or remain symbolic embellishments, but the stone's surface feels cool beneath your touch as if preserving a secret chill. Finally, you stand back at the longhouse door, cloak brushing against carved runes promising warmth and safety. You've traversed myths of frost giant gifts, godly horns, and communal shrines, gathering each lore fragment like snowflakes. Historians still argue whether any of these mythical references point to real chilled delights or simply used cold as a narrative device to underscore power and wonder. Yet, whether truth or fancy, the sagas echo with the allure of frost, the same allure that compels you to reach for one last taste. You melt the final shard of ice in your hand, noting its clarity and fragility, and let it trickle into a bowl of thick cream. As the two meet, you close your eyes, savoring the soft hiss of melting crystals and the promise of a flavor born as much from imagination as from cow's milk. You lift the bowl to your lips, sweet, cold, and tinged with stories older than any longship, and feel the magic of legend swirl inside. You awaken to a shaft of golden light where the longhouse's smoke vent gapes like an open mouth, and you realize it's time to widen your lens beyond Scandinavia's shores. Pull on your cloak and follow the shipping lanes in your mind's eye, past icy fjords to warm deserts and misty mountains. Because tonight, you'll compare the Vikings' chilly experiments with far-flung contemporaries who may have beaten them to frozen treats. First, you find yourself in 9th century Persia, at the lavish court of the Abbasid caliphs. Imagine royal servants carrying shallow earthenware bowls heaped with falude, vermicelli noodles spun in rosewater-stained sugar syrup, then bathed in ice harvested from nearby mountains. Mainstream sources confirm that Persians built yekshals, conical brick ice houses, that stored winter ice under thick insulation, producing ice year-round for these delicacies. Historians still argue whether the Yekshals' advanced design directly influenced later ice storage methods in Europe, or emerged independently as a Middle Eastern innovation. But whatever the case, the Persians had a head start on chilling sugar-spun noodle desserts. You dip your spoon into a bowl of falude, tasting the chewy, floral noodles gliding amid bracing frost, an electric contrast of warm spices and icy refreshment. A quirky fringe account tells of an itinerant Persian merchant who loaded camels with ice blocks to barter with distant lands, claiming that ice is worth more than gold in summer's peak. Historians still argue whether such trans-desert ice caravans truly crossed sandy wastes, or belonged to the realm of overheated travelogues. But you can't help imagining a caravan of frosty treasures in the blazing sun. Next, you travel further east to Tang-era China, where imperial elites savor shui hua bing, literally water-flower ice, a slushy mixture of sweetened water and crushed snow. Mainstream Chinese annals record that villages near mountain peaks collected fluffy snow, transported it by sedan chairs to palace kitchens, and mixed it with fruit juices for summer banquets. Historians still argue whether shui hua being was confined to courtly extravagance or trickled down to local festivals, but the existence of specialized snow-collecting crews suggests it was more than a fleeting novelty. You taste a spoonful of shui hua being infused with plum syrup and feel the delicate frost melt on your tongue like spring rain. A modern aside drifts in. If you've ever slurped granita at a cafe, you're echoing Imperial China's early experiments with snow and juice. Then imagine adding a dollop of cream, something Chinese cooks wouldn't have had, creating a hybrid between shui hua bing and Norse snow cream. Historians still argue whether any cross-cultural culinary contact allowed such hybrids to form along Silk Road routes, but your taste buds tingle at the thought. Your journey continues to ancient India, where frozen dairy appears in the form of kulfi, dense milk loaves flavored with cardamom and pistachio, frozen in metal molds set in ice and salt mixtures. Mainstream culinary historians trace kulfi's origins to Mughal kitchens in the 16th century, where cooks placed metal pots into pits filled with ice and rock salt, agitating them by hand to achieve a firm, custard-like treat. Historians still argue whether South Asian ice salt techniques evolved from earlier Hellenistic methods or emerged independently, but kulfi's chewy texture and aromatic spices showcase a distinct tradition of frozen desserts that rivals any Viking slush. You break off a wedge of rose-spiced kulfi and savor its rich, milky firmness. A quirky detail whispers that some Delhi cooks once flavored kulfi with saffron imported via Central Asian traders, the same saffron that might have dotted Persian ice or Viking snow cream, creating a triangular connection of spice across empire. Historians still argue whether saffron kulfi crossed those trade routes, or was a later culinary adaptation, but the interplay of spice and ice unites these cultures in your mind. Now mind traveling north, you arrive at Byzantine Constantinople, where snow and honey concoctions appear in medical texts as fever reducers. Mainstream Byzantine physicians recorded mixing snow with pomegranate syrup or rose petals to cool hot patients. Historians still argue whether these mixtures were therapeutic tonics or simply early desserts, but the medical use of ice underscores how civilizations valued cold beyond mere preservation. You taste a spoonful of rose honey snow, feeling its gentle balm wash over you, and wonder if a Viking healer might have borrowed such methods when a Jarl's fever spiked during spring thaw. A quick leap back to the Norse world reveals how the Vikings' simpler techniques compare. Rather than engineered ice houses or salt ice baths, they relied on earth pits, river blocks, and straw insulation. You recall the snow domes of Section 4 and the primitive slate-scraped slushes of Section 11, and you marvel at the resourcefulness in the absence of imported salt or sugar. Yet without nets of trade directing exotic ingredients, Norse cooks would have lacked the syrups and spices that emboldened Persian and Indian desserts. Jumping to Mesoamerica, you envision Aztec markets where vendors sell chopped ice, topped with fruit sauces, an encounter first recorded by Spanish friars in the 16th. While Aztec snow hunting expeditions to mountaintops surely postdate Viking Age, the concept of chasing snow for relief unites these distant people. Historians still argue whether similar traditions arose independently in mountainous societies or reflect universal human ingenuity when faced with heat. You crunch ice tossed with limeberry syrup and think of Vikings chasing fjord ice for dairy, connected across time by the simple desire for cold sweetener. Back in Europe, you step into medieval Sicily, where Arabs taught Sicilian cooks to blend snow with citrus juices and sugar, precursors to modern granite. Mainstream records confirm that Palermo's quarries supplied blocks of marble white ice to street vendors, who shaved it thin and drizzled lemon syrup. Historians still argue whether those early granites influenced later Italian gelato, or remained a distinct frozen but uncultured treat, but that lineage eventually flows into the gelateria you know today. Turning westward to the North African Maghreb, you find similar snow and rosewater desserts sold in Marrakech souks, shaped by Berber mountain trade. These icy confections use snow collected from Atlas peaks, cooled with local sweetener. Historians still argue whether North African snow desserts influenced Al-Andalus culinary culture, and indirectly European freezing methods, but the interconnected web of Mediterranean trade makes such exchanges plausible. As your mind voyage circles back to Scandinavia, sense how each culture's environment and resources shaped their frozen treats. Persia's yakka chows and sugar-spun noodles, China's mountain snow slush, India's salt ice custards, Byzantium's medicinal frost, Aztec mountain expeditions, Sicilian granita heritage, and Maghreb's rose snow blend. The Vikings' simpler snow pits and dairy slushes may lack the spice complexity or refined textures of these global counterparts, but they speak of a hands-on ingenuity driven by necessity and curiosity. A playful thought surfaces: picture a global summit of ice cream pioneers, Persian engineers, Chinese snow collectors, Indian kulfi makers, Viking snow diggers, each presenting their signature frozen treat. Your high-tech yakka chow, you'd say to a Persian envoy, meets our rustic snow cream. The Persian would raise an eyebrow. You'd shrug and scoop a handful of Norse slush, gravelly and sweet, diplomacy by dessert. Historians still argue whether the Vikings learned techniques from these cultures via trade hubs like Volga Khazar ports, or kept their practices entirely homegrown. Perhaps Persian sugar arrived in tiny caches carried on amber-laden ships, or Chinese ice methods seeped through Rus intermediaries. But without written recipes, the trail remains faint. You step out onto a grassy knoll overlooking the fjord, the northern lights rippling overhead as if applauding your journey across continents. You scoop up a handful of snow from the ground, press it lightly into your palm, and let it melt with a drop of clotted cream sourced from this land. The contrast of global innovation and local simplicity emerges on your tongue, an echo of every culture's quest for frozen delight. Sleep closes in like a soft blanket. You whisper a final toast to human creativity and the cold that unites us. And as your eyes drift shut, you carry the flavors of Persia, China, India and Scandinavia blended in your dreams, proof that ice and curiosity know no border. You wake in the gentle half-light of your modern bedroom, the soft hum of an air conditioner replacing the hiss of a longhouse hearth. And you realize this isn't ancient Scandinavia, but a living history event sprawled across a field nearby. Today, you'll step into the shoes of revivalist cooks and experimental archaeologists, those daring souls who scour dusty manuscripts, chisel out snow pits in backyards, and assemble faux Viking kitchens on festival grounds. Their mission: to reconstruct frozen treats that might never have passed beyond legend. So zip up your fleece-lined cloak, adjust your utility belt of wooden spoons and portable ice shavers, and follow me into the world of modern reenactment. As you emerge from your tent, complete with fur blankets and a reproduction turf roof, you're greeted by the low murmur of fellow enthusiasts stirring cauldrons of curdled milk over propane burners, a concession to modern safety. Mainstream experimental archaeologists confirm that many living history groups model their processes on archaeological residue analysis, using bent wood tubs, flint scrapers, and antler tines discovered in Viking Age sites. They strive for authenticity by sourcing heirloom breeds of dairy goats and grass-fed cows, yielding milk fat levels akin to medieval herds. Historians still argue whether these reconstructed milks truly mirror their ancient counterparts. Differences in forage and climate might yield subtly distinct flavors, but the effort underscores a collective hunger to taste the past. You wander over to the snow pit lab, where a neatly squared pit has been dug into the ground, lined with straw and insulated with juniper boughs. Someone tosses in freshly shoveled snow, compressing it until it resembles granular ice. A pale-faced cook wears neoprene gloves as they pour warmed, whey-thickened cream into the pit, then cover it with more straw and turf. You can't help but press your cheek against the cool surround despite the summer heat. The pit's interior hisses with cold. A quirky tidbit: one reenactor rigged a battery-powered fan to simulate winter winds over the pit, convinced that a draft improves freezing by whisking away latent heat. Historians still argue whether actual Viking cooks understood airflow's effect on freezing, or simply relied on naturally breezy sites. But the modern air artifice adds drama to the demonstration. Nearby, a cluster of participants is using a replicated iron ring setup from Section 11. A small bentwood tub suspended within a larger barrel packed with ice and snow, the gap filled with layers of straw. As they rock the inner tub in a rhythmic motion, you spot flecks of cream coalescing into frosty granules. They call this the double-barrel churn, an homage to interpretations of archaeological finds. A mainstream fact: churning with agitation minimizes large ice crystals, yielding a smoother texture, an insight verified by comparative tests with and without motion. Historians still argue whether Vikings practiced this method intentionally or if flotsam from everyday tools inspired later scholars to retroactively assign purpose. But you dip a wooden spoon in for a tentative taste and grin at its coarse but undeniably chilled bouquet. 3 o'clock rolls around, mealtime for the reenactors, and you join a communal table laden with modern interpretations of Viking ice cream. Bowls bear 2 varieties, a honey and cloudberry slush set in a snow pit, and a juniper-infused cream frozen in small metal molds cooled with ice salt baths. The latter, modeled after Mediterranean salt ice techniques, represents a speculative what-if scenario fringe, yet tantalizing. You sample the mold's output first. Its texture is denser than gelato, firm enough to hold shape but melting quickly on your tongue, releasing piney juniper notes and a whisper of salt. A light-hearted aside, someone dubbed it Valhalla Popsicle, complete with a carved wooden stick, though purists sneer at any modern stick insertion. Historians still argue whether Vikings ever imported salt-scooping trade methods, or if such salt ice baths remained an Eastern Mediterranean specialty. But the frosty pot vanishes in seconds, and you beg for another. Between bites you wander to a corner workshop where a local blacksmith demonstrates forging an ice pick inspired by a 9th century find. Its long hooked tip and sharpened flukes gleam in the sunlight. A reenactor proudly shatters a small block of ice with it, chipping off shards into a wooden bowl of hot cream. The crackling collisions draw a small crowd. Kids squeal at the spray of icy mist. A quirky detail: one reenactor calls this a Viking snow cone station, complete with edible conical waffle shells shaped like tiny long ships. Historians still argue whether actual Middle Ages gourmands fashioned edible vessels for chilled treats, or whether they stuck to bowls, but the long-ship shell adds undeniable theatrical flourish. As evening approaches, you gather with the group for a feast reenactment, complete with mead horns and slow-roasted boar. At the end of the meal, the organizer dims the LED torches, a concession to wartime reenactment concerns, and invites everyone to witness a frost ceremony. A volunteer clad in faux fur garb emerges carrying a carved antler tine. Your callback to Section 11 scoop dripping with coarse ice from a snow dome. They dip it into a large basin of whipped skyr, rich with fresh cream from the on-site dairies, stirring until a thick slurry forms. Each participant then takes turns stirring and sampling. The ceremony ends with a hushed toast: "May our summers be sweet and our winters cold." Historians still argue whether any ritualized ice cream toast existed in Viking culture or if this is purely a modern invention inspired by saga toasts. But you feel the weight of tradition inflected with playful invention. You step away to talk with the candidate who's collecting data on the sensory profiles of these revived treats. They explain their method: blind taste tests, comparing snow pit slush to ice salt cream and store-bought ice cream. Preliminary results suggest that snow pit slush scores highest in authenticity perception, while ice salt cream ranks highest for smoothness. A mainstream academic point: reconstructive experiments like these help refine our understanding of daily life in the past, highlighting both technological capability and culinary taste preference. Historians still argue whether sensory data can truly capture medieval palates. Modern tongues might prize sweetness and smoothness differently, but the cross-disciplinary work brings you closer to bridging centuries. Darkness falls fully, and lanterns gleam as you join a final workshop on recipe adaptation. A guest chef, a food historian with a penchant for ASMR-friendly narration, guides you through making Viking ice cream too. As you cover the cups with cloth and shake your cooler bag, they whisper soft reminders. Listen for the slush, feel the cream firming, taste for the herbs. The gentle cadence of their voice, paired with the tactile ritual, lulls you into a near trance, an accidental echo of the ASMR style you love on YouTube. A quirky aside: they joke that this method would have let Vikings channel their inner ice cream truck, but without music, only the clink of salt and ice. Historians still argue whether Vikings had knowledge of salt's freezing point depression properties or discovered it by happy accident. But the demonstration feels revelatory. At the festival's close, you find yourself back at your tent, bowl in hand, sampling the evening's final batch of berry-infused snow cream. Each spoonful carries the warmth of communal effort and the cold reality of crushed snow. You reflect on how modern reenactments blend rigorous scholarship with creative interpretation, merging fact and fringe in pursuit of a more immersive path. Historians still argue over every detail, from pit insulation materials to the exact timing of churning rituals, but the collaborative spirit persists, powered by curiosity and a shared craving for cold sweetener. You crawl into your fur-lined sleeping bag, the distant embers of the mock longhouse hearth blinking out one by one. Outside, a real breeze stirs the grass and you almost hear the hiss of ancient snow pit. You close your eyes, tasting the combination of honey, cream, juniper, and salt on your tongue, an echo of experimentation past and present. Whether these modern reconstructions capture the true flavor of Viking frozen treats, or simply create something new under an old name, is a question for future debate. But one thing's sure, the spirit of exploration and the hunger for chilled delights lives on, centuries after the last real Jarl licked snow from his antlers. You wake in your own bed, sunlight filtering through curtains, and realize that the saga of Viking ice cream didn't end with sagas or snow pits. It lives on in our modern myths, movies, and marketing pitches. From blockbuster films to tabletop games, from artisan festivals to tourist lodges, the notion of Norse frost treats has seeped into popular culture, like melted honey over cloudberry slush. Tonight, you'll wander through that echo chamber, spotting how Viking ice cream persists in unexpected corners of your world. First, you might recall the blockbuster fantasy flick where burly warriors pause mid-battle to scoop snow cream from antler bowls. Yes, that cameo in Berserker's Feast 2015 wasn't just fan service. Mainstream film analyses note that directors often lean on Viking tropes, long ships, horned helmets, historically inaccurate of course, and frozen cream gags to evoke ruggedness and whimsy. You might laugh at the scene's absurdity, a frost giant handing a wooden spoon to a shield maiden who quips, "I preferred my mead unchilled," before biting into a snow cream scoop. That mainstream fact speaks to Hollywood's love of dramatic license, blending imagined dairy rituals with CGI snowflakes. Historians still argue whether such cinematic portrayals do more harm than good, spark curiosity or entrench misconceptions. But you can't deny the visceral thrill of watching slushy cream arc through the air in slow-mo, catching glints of firelight as it lands in a carved bowl. Next, you wander into the gaming realm, where tabletop designers have turned Viking ice cream into a game mechanic. In the popular board game Feast of the Fjords, players collect snow tokens and dairy resources to craft frost delicacies, scoring extra victory points for chilled mead cream. A quirky tidbit: some rulebooks suggest using blue-colored sand for snow and tiny resin cow figurines for dairy, because nothing says authentic like modeling clay snow and herd tokens. Historians still argue whether these playful mechanics trivialize genuine historical practices or simply introduce newcomers to Norse culture, but either way you might find yourself eyeing the game box and craving a scoop of your own. On streaming platforms, you stumble across ASMR channels dedicated to ancient cuisine reconstruction. One creator whispers softly while stirring icy granules in a wooden bowl, citing Section 4's snow pit method and padding their microphone with faux sheepskin for perfect ASMR crackle. They tease fringe theories about Vikings importing salt from Brittany for faster freezing, all while sprinkling juniper berries and honey. You probably won't survive this auditory assault without craving chill and sugar, but the video's popularity, tens of thousands of views, proves there's a market for frost-laden nostalgia. Historians still argue whether such content blurs the lines between scholarship and clickbait, but you press play again, entranced by every crisp pop. Then there's the heritage tourism sector. Villages across Norway and Iceland now advertise Viking ice cream experiences, where tourists don furs, trek to a reconstructed snowdome and churn cream with antler thyme. One lodge even offers a Frost of the Gods package, complete with candlelit longhouse feasts and DIY snow cream workshops. A mainstream travel review from 2024 notes that bookings doubled after a popular travel influencer posted a reel titled Culinary Time Travel Viking Edition. Historians still argue whether recreating snow pits with modern insulation genuinely honors Viking ingenuity or simply cashes in on kitsch. But as you scroll through smiling guests draped in furs, you'll admit the photos look cozy enough to melt any skeptic's heart. Artisans have also stepped in. Specialty ice cream shops in Reykjavik and Oslo now feature Norse nostalgia flavors, skyr and snow churned in a salted ice bath, juniper hearth flecked with resinous berry bits and amber honeycomb, a nod to those salt crystal trade routes. A quirky tidbit: one shop serves the skyr and snow in miniature wooden troughs, complete with edible straw garnish because authenticity is apparently measured in edible props. Historians still argue whether these modern interpretations stay faithful to possible Viking recipes or merely ride the trend wave, but locals queue at dawn anyway, eager for a taste of frozen pie. You might have seen pop-up events at Comic-Cons, where costumed Vikings offer free samples of frostbound cream. The booth's banner proclaims "as seen in your favorite saga," while volunteers ladle pastel blue sorbets into horn cups. A modern aside: if you've ever wondered why everyone's Instagram tagline reads "Viking vibes," this booth answers the meme economy, leveraging imagined ice cream for likes and follow. Historians still argue whether turning culture into cosplay concessions honors heritage or trivializes it. But hey, the sorbet is surprisingly good. Even music festivals have hopped on board. At one Nordic folk fest, you could wander into a cream and chill tent where DJs spin trance remixes of skaldic chants while bartenders blend sky, crushed ice and cloudberry syrup into slushy cocktails. Mainstream festival reports note that attendance soared by 20% when the cream and chill bar opened, proof that wellness-driven partygoers crave cold carbs almost as much as cold beef. Historians still argue whether such mashups disrespect cultural origins or simply evolve traditions, but you could argue the chill-out tent lives up to its name, both literally and figuratively. On social media, DIY enthusiasts share Viking ice cream hacks using modern freezers. Freeze cream in silicone llama molds, then crush into snow, mixing with honey and juniper. A fringe community insists that adding sea salt mimics brine-cooled slurries, despite no evidence Vikings knew about freezing point depression. Historians still argue whether these hacks illuminate or obscure authentic practices, but you've probably tried at least one hack while binge-watching Norse dramas. Finally, your favorite Monday night trivia game slipped in a question: which ancient culture is credited with possibly inventing ice cream through snow pits? A. Persians, B. Chinese, C. Vikings, or D. Romans? The correct answer was marked C, much to the chagrin of trivia purists. A quirky bit of trivia: the mistake sparked a flurry of tweets, with Vikings reclaiming the crown of chilling innovation for a day. Historians still argue whether quizzes should stick to better documented cultures, but you grinned at the idea of Norse slush reigning supreme, even if only in a pub quiz. You stretch, yawn, and realize that the legacy of Viking ice cream thrives on the tension between myth and method, fact and fantasy. Whether it's a cinematic slow-mo scoop, a board game token, an ASMR whisper, or a tourist's chilly grin, every echo keeps the conversation and the craving alive. You might chuckle at how far a half-remembered saga has traveled, from snowpit speculation to artisan gelato, from gaming tables to festival tents. As you nestle back under your blankets, the hum of your freezer begins to feel like a lullaby. You imagine one last time scooping cream from a rustic wooden tub, pressing your face into the cold and savoring that elusive first bite. Historians still argue whether any of it reflects true Viking practice or collective imagination, but you realize that the sweetest legacy of all is curiosity and the endless desire to taste history, one frosted spoonful at a time. You awaken in the quiet hush of your own hearth-lit chamber, the echoes of frost crackling through 17 centuries of memory, fading into the soft drone of your evening fan. Now it's time to gather all you've seen, from snow pits and butter cellars to saga whispers and experimental reconstructions, and lay them before you like a procession of frosty relics, each one a shard of the bigger story. You trudge forward in thought, feeling the weight of centuries lighten with every step. First, recall the raw materials: milk from hardy Norse herds, snow from frozen fjords, honey from woodland hives, and berries bursting with summer juice. Mainstream archaeological evidence shows that Viking communities everywhere maintained mixed dairy herds, stored ice in insulated pits, and harvested river slabs, methods that underpin every conceivable recipe you've imagined. Whether you pressed bent wood tubs, wielded iron rings, or scraped ice with flint, the infrastructure was there. Historians still argue whether these tools were used primarily for preservation or for playful experimentation, but the dual purpose is clear. Vikings treated cold as both necessity and novelty. Then remember the flavors: honey's warm sweetness dancing with the tang of cloudberries, the resinous snap of juniper berries, the salty uplift of imported sea salt, the floral perfume of elderflower and rosewater whispers, carried along trade winds. A quirky tidbit: fringe culinary writers occasionally claim that Vikings even dipped foam from mead into snow, creating a heady, frothy precursor to frozen cocktails you see on poolside menus today. Historians still argue whether mead foam ices were more mythic muse than mouth-watering reality, but the idea sparkles in your mind. You've witnessed feasts where jarls scooped honey snow sundaes from communal troughs, then staged berry toss contests to punctuate the cold with laughter. You've strode across archaeology trenches tracing scorch marks on tubs and grooves carved into stone presses, evidence that heat and cold cycles might have been part of ritual kitchen alchemy. You've heard saga poets weave frost into metaphors, their lines hinting at frosted whey and hidden codes that might encode recipes or simply conjure atmosphere. And you've traveled through the modern world: film sets, board games, ASMR channels, reenactment festivals, where Viking ice cream lives on as legend, installation art and immersive tourism. In that kaleidoscope, one thing stands out: the Vikings' relationship with cold was never passive. They harnessed ice's power to preserve, to celebrate, and to astonish. Their snow pits were more than larders, they were potential laboratories of flavor. Their sagas used frost to shock and delight audiences, perhaps reflecting real chills of breakfast dairy pressed against snow. Their rituals, whether in burials or feast ceremonies, sometimes included ice as symbolic offerings. All this suggests that while we can't write down a step-by-step take cream mix with snow recipe in any medieval cookbook, the ingredients for ice cream were undeniably in play. Yet despite all these tantalizing clues, archaeological finds laid bare manuscripts whispering poetic frost, experimental labs humming with electric fans. No definitive proof remains. No intact Viking recipe scroll emerges from a burial cairn. No perfectly preserved snow cream lurks in a peat bog, and that absence casts a long shadow of doubt, prompting the perennial refrain. Historians still argue whether Vikings ever perfected ice cream, or simply flirted with freezing cream as a momentary diversion. But perhaps that uncertainty is the truest thread tying you to those ancient cooks. You lying in your bed, fan humming, senses primed by centuries of possibility, are not so different from a Viking farmhand, sneaking a taste of sky-laced snow under torchlight. In that shared curiosity, tasting the cold, testing the texture, chasing sweetness, you bridge eras. You feel their thrill when a sluice of cream dips into ice and hardens into something new. You feel their wonder at cold's transformative power, that human impulse to play with ingredients, to experiment at the edge of practicality, to delight in simple pleasures. This is the real legacy of Viking ice cream. As this final chapter unfolds, picture yourself at the lip of a snow pit one last time. You lean in, scoop a spoonful of slushy cream, and taste the echo of hearth smoke, the tang of fermented whey, the zing of honeyed berries, and the whisper of salt from distant sea. The textures are coarse, the flavors primal, far from the swirl of modern gelato, but vivid in their honesty and breadth. You close your eyes and let the aftertaste linger, a collage of every era you've visited. You sense the breath of sagas in the wind, feel the pulse of reenactors in the soil, taste the global dialogues of spice traders in each icy flake. In that moment, all doubts dissolve. Whether Vikings had a recipe for ice cream, or merely an impulse to cool their cream, the spirit of the pursuit lives on in you. Wind down. Now let your eyelids grow heavy as the embers of this long tale fade into embers of memory. Breathe out slowly. Feel the soft weight of your blanket, and let each exhale carry away the final lingering chill. The world beyond this moment can wait. Tonight, only your steady breath and the distant hum of promise remain. Imagine the cold air slipping away in gentle ribbons, replaced by warmth pooling in your chest, a hearth kindling beneath your ribs. No matter how far you've wandered through snow-laden fields, mythic halls or modern reenactments, this journey ends here, in the quiet sanctuary of your body. Each thought of frost and cream drifts upward, and dissolves like snowflakes on the tongue. Sensations soften, edges blur, the clatter of spoons on wooden bowls recedes into soft echoes. Allow the comfort of uncertainty to settle in. You needn't know every secret or unearth every clue. In the realm of sleep, questions rest as peacefully as answers. Let the last taste of imagined frost melt, leaving only warmth and a gentle smile. Your mind, like cream smoothed by time, will find its own stillness. Drift now, weightless, into the tender embrace of dream. If shadows dance at the edge of your vision, know they're but the final whispers of ice, and they too will fade. Tomorrow the world awakens anew, but for now surrender to the hush, the soft sigh of sleep beckoning. Good night, wanderer, sweet dream.